AZ-305, Designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solutions Questions and Answers Set Number 1. You have an Azure solution that uses the Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB API. You need to ensure that you can restore data in the solution to any point in time from the last 30 days by using a self-service solution. Which backup solution should you use? Option 1, Azure Backup. Option 2, Azure Cosmos DB Continuous Backup. Option 3, Microsoft Azure Recovery Services, MARS. Option 4, Azure Cosmos DB Periodic Backup. Correct answer, Azure Cosmos DB Continuous Backup. Explanation: Continuous backup mode in Azure Cosmos DB provides self-service restore for any point in time from the last 30 days. Periodic backup mode in Azure Cosmos DB enforces a minimum backup time of an hour, not any point in time, and requires a support ticket for restore. Azure Backup and MARS does not support Azure Cosmos DB Backup. You have an on-premises data center that connects to Azure by using ExpressRoute. The on-premises data center uses Microsoft System Center Data Protection Manager, DPM, for backup and restore of on-premises Windows virtual machines. You need to ensure that backups from the on-premises virtual machines are copied to Azure. The solution must use the minimum amount of administrative effort. What should you recommend? Option 1, deploy a DPM server in Azure. Option 2, deploy Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS, to the on-premises network. Option 3, install the Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS, agent on the DPM server. Option 4, replace DPM with Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS. Correct answer, install the Microsoft Azure Backup Server, MABS, agent on the DPM server. Explanation: Installing the MARS agent on the DPM server allows the backups to be copied to recovery services vaults in Azure. Replacing DPM with MABS, deploying a DPM server in Azure, and deploying MABS to the on-premises network all require a lot of change. You have an Azure storage account that contains a file share. You need to recommend a solution to automatically back up the file share. What should you recommend using to store the backups? Option 1, Azure Files in a second Azure region. Option 2, Azure Key Vault. Option 3, Backup Vault. Option 4, Recovery Services Vault. Correct answer, Recovery Services Vault. Explanation: Recovery Service Vaults and Backup Vaults provide protection for data from different data sources. Azure Files is a supported data source for Recovery Service Vaults. You have an Azure subscription that contains Azure SQL databases. You need to recommend a backup solution for the databases. The solution must ensure that the backups are configurable for at least 90 days. What should you recommend? Option 1, GeoZone Redundant Storage, GZRS. Option 2, Locally Redundant Storage, LRS. Option 3, Long-Term Retention, LTR. Option 4, Transaction Log Backups. Correct answer, Long-Term Retention, LTR. Explanation: LTR is required to store a backup for more than 35 days. LRS and GZRS options are valid storage redundancy options. Transaction log backups are not relevant for this scenario. You have an Azure subscription that contains a storage account named Storage One. The Storage One account stores unstructured data. You need to recommend a backup solution for Storage One. What should you recommend? Option 1, Azure Backup for Blobs. Option 2, Azure Site Recovery. Option 3, Long-Term Retention. Correct answer, Azure Backup for Blobs. Explanation: Azure Backup for Blobs is the correct option to enable a backup vault and a backup policy for blob protection. Azure Site Recovery does not provide backup for blobs. Azure Site Recovery is disaster recovery solution for on-premises workloads. Long-term retention is for Azure SQL databases. You are designing a highly available multi-tenant Azure App Service web app. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that the web app is available across zones in a single Azure region. The solution must minimize costs. Which app service plan should you recommend for the web app? Option 1, Dedicated Compute Premium v2 P1 v2. Option 2, Dedicated Compute Premium v3 P1 v3. Option 3, Dedicated Compute Standard S1. Option 4, Shared Compute D1. Correct answer, Dedicated Compute Premium v2 P1 v2. Explanation, only Premium v2 and Premium v3 are zone redundant. P1 v2 has lower costs. You have an Azure deployment used as disaster recovery landing zone for an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server solution. You need to recommend a high availability solution for a SQL Server virtual machine that allows for minimal data loss. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you recommend? Option 1, Always on Failover Cluster Instance, FCI. Option 2, Azure Backup. Option 3, Azure Site Recovery. Option 4, Log Shipping. Correct answer, Log Shipping. Explanation, Log Shipping is the correct answer as it provides an easy-to-deploy and administer high-availability solution based on backup and restore. Distributed availability groups require Windows Server Failover Cluster, WSFC, which is not easy to deploy or administer. Azure Backup is not the correct answer, as it is not a high-availability solution. Always on FCI requires that the FCI be implemented, and is, therefore, not easy to deploy and administer. You are designing a web app named App1 that will be deployed to Azure. App1 will depend on an Azure SQL database named DB1. Resources will be deployed to 2 Azure regions. DB1 will have data geo-replicated between both regions. You need to recommend a high availability design for App1 that minimizes downtime. Which approach should you recommend? Option 1, Active/Active. Option 2, Active/Passive with Cold Standby. Option 3, Active/Passive with Hot Standby. Option 4, Backup/Restore. Correct answer, Active/Passive with Hot Standby. Explanation, the fastest option is to have both regions active and ready and to use load balancing. Because DB1 does not support this scenario, an Active/Active solution cannot be used. With Active/Passive, Hot Standby provides the fastest recovery time. Cold Standby provides the lowest cost option. Backup/Restore will not minimize downtime. You are designing an Azure Virtual Machine solution that has a front-end and a back-end, each hosted in its own virtual machine scale set. You need to ensure that the virtual machines from the front-end and back-end communicate by using the lowest latency possible. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Application Security Groups. Option 2, Availability Sets. Option 3, Availability Zones. Option 4, Proximity Placement Groups. Correct answer, Proximity Placement Groups. Explanation, by placing virtual machines in the same proximity group, they are deployed close together for lower latency. Availability sets separate resources on different physical hosts. Availability zones separate virtual machines in different Azure data centers within a zone for availability. Security groups are used for Network Security Group (NSG) rules. You are designing an Azure Virtual Machine solution to host a stateless application. You need to ensure that the number of virtual machines used is increased and decreased automatically based on CPU usage. What should you include in the design? Option 1, Azure API Management. Option 2, Azure App Service. Option 3, a load balancer with a virtual machine scale set. Option 4, a load balancer with virtual machines. Correct answer, a load balancer with a virtual machine scale set. Explanation, a load balancer with a virtual machine scale set allows for autoscaling. A load balancer with virtual machines does not provide autoscaling. Azure App Service and Azure API Management cannot run virtual machines.